Hola, buenos días a todos.
Hello, good day everyone from Latin America who is joining us today in this third webinar on decarbonizing urban transport, and good afternoon to our European participants. Before we begin, two logistic notices. Most of the event will be carried out in Spanish, but we will have some English interventions. So we have simultaneous interpretation, which you can activate in the left bottom corner. Second, please, you feel free to leave your questions in the Q&A section.
Today in this third webinar on decarbonization of urban transport, and good afternoon to our participants from Europe. Before we begin, please note that the session will be conducted mainly in Spanish, but we will have some interventions in English. So you can activate simultaneous translation in the lower corner of the screen. En nombre de la División de Transporte del Banco Interamericano de Desarrollo y del Foro
On
Internacional.
behalf of the Transport Division of the IADB and the ITF of OECD, it is a pleasure for us to have you all here. We will be presenting and talking about the results on two analyses carried out for Bogota, and the main objective of which were to support planning in the city for low carbon emissions transport systems. The event will be divided into three sections. First, we will have some opening remarks by IADB representatives and the Mobility Secretariat of Bogota. Then the ITF team will do a general summary of the urban transport challenges in the Bogota city, always considering a decarbonizing strategy and highly emphasizing the most effective policies to achieve those objectives and certain modeling exercises. After that, we will hear representatives from the public sector and local IADB and academia experts to talk about those results, and then we will open the floor for some questions from the audience. So without further ado, I will give the floor to Nestor Roa. He's the head of the Division of Transport of the IADB. Nestor, you have the floor. Thank you very much, Laureen.
To the colleagues in the other side of the ocean. Es un gusto para mí estar por acá.
It is a pleasure for me to be here. I would first of all like to say hi to Juan Esteban Martinez. He's the Undersecretariat of the Mobility District Secretariat of Bogota, the colleagues of his team from the Secretariat of Mobility of Bogota, public administration colleagues from Colombia and Bogota, my colleagues to ITF, and my colleagues from IADB and the rest of the audience. I would like to say hi to all of you. It is a pleasure and a privilege for me to be here as part of this ITF, and I would like to welcome everyone to this third virtual session on the initiative of decarbonizing urban transport in Latin America. In this case, this session will be focused on particular specific results for the city of Bogota. As you said before, Noreen, this is an initiative that is a result of a technical cooperation of the IADB as a public good region initiative, and headed by the Division of Transport of the IADB. We promote in this program a neutral mobility in terms of carbon emissions to mitigate climate change effects. As the head of the Division of Transport of IADB, and somehow and surely as a person who was born and raised in Bogota, I am very pleased to have Bogota having chosen to participate in this initiative. It has been intense. These intense 3 years, we analyzed the policies and trends in the city, travel information, air quality, and we then assessed and identified more effective strategies for urban transport. I do not want to overlap with ITF's presentation, but I do want to say that it is extremely interesting for me, all the interests that have been suggested in the current scenario, political scenario. The share of cars and bikes and motorcycles in Bogota will go from 26% in 2018 to 31% in 2050. So it is clear that, as we have been talking about before, we see that it is a reality, the fact that we cannot continue to have a business as usual scenario, even when we do have aggressive investments and actions in public transport in Bogota and that are unprecedented in the region. I think that we have a very important situation and work to do immediately. I think it's very difficult to consider or think about decarbonization without actions. We need to stop the growth of vehicles and, in the case of Bogota, the case of motorcycles. That increase in the demand calls for a new role of public policies, with striking a balance with the different needs in the short and long and medium term, protecting the growth and trying to understand the sector better. We try to understand the incentives that drive the vehicle manufacturing industry, and we have to understand users of private cars and public transport as differentiated segments. We need to analyze the trends of car usage in this considerable context of ride shares that we see increasing. This is essential, and it does not mean that decarbonizing transport is impossible, but the change will not only happen via the markets, and it will probably entail a combination of measures that go way beyond pushing public transport forward. We all know that that is number one priority, but that is not enough to maintain a modal grid that is similar or even better than the current one. Nicolas Estupinian talked about on Tuesday, said that a challenge from this pandemic is how to avoid trips for signified cities. We cannot forget that transport change is essential for climate change, but the sector has to deal with other externalities like combustion, road safety, equality, to name a few. That is why it was a pleasure to listen on Tuesday representatives from Bogotá, Buenos Aires, and Mexico City, because the collaboration of this initiative created bonds between the secretariats, which have been beneficial for good practices in urban transport. The cities have similar situations, but peculiar situations as well. We have to acknowledge the challenges that we face by the pandemic, and we have to consider the possibilities imposed by COVID to rethink the impact that this will have in short and long term. I would also like to thank again to the teams of the Bogotá Mobility Secretariat, whose participation was essential to consolidate this initiative. And also I would like to thank the ITF and the IADB teams for their efforts invested in materializing the products that we will see soon. We hope that this initiative will help define a more ambitious roadmap, and that the city of Bogotá can comply with that and with the global environmental goals of reducing GHG emissions and fighting against climate change. From IADB, we reaffirm our commitment to work with you hand in hand and to push forward the planning of urban, low-carbon transport systems. The bank is a strategic partner in mobility in the city, so we will provide first-line support to the metro and the green corridor. As Nicolas mentioned on Monday, we have managed to achieve great cooperation with Bogota, and we are committed to keep supporting you. Hopefully these debates will help strengthen institutional collaboration schemes and consolidate cooperation with multilateral banks and other international entities that work with transport, sustainability, and climate change topics. Thank you then, Laureen. Good luck for today. Thank you, Nestor, for those kind opening remarks. I will then give the floor to Juan Esteban Martinez. He's the Undersecretary of Public Policy and Mobility in the city of Bogota, who will give his own opening remarks. Juan Esteban, you have the floor. Thank you. Thank you, Lorraine. I would like to warmly greet all the participants and panel members. Nestor, thank you for your kind words. From the city of Bogota, from the Mobility Secretariat, and as representative of all players in the mobility aspect, Transmilenio, Metro, etc. We are very happy of this hard work that we've done, and we are expectant to see the results. We believe that this tool will be extremely useful to deal with all the comprehensive matters that we need to structure within our city so that we can deal and face the future challenges in terms of mobility and the improvement of air quality. Bogota is considerably transitioning in terms of mobility. So happily, we have been doing these approaches with ITF and the IADB. And Nestor is right. IADB has substantially supported us in many projects, not only in terms of Metro Bogotá and the 7th or La Séptima, but also in the structuring of the public operator that we have. And that is a very important challenge that needs to be addressed to improve mobility. Bogota is currently at a crucial moment. First of all, when it comes to dealing with the new changes faced that we are being faced by the pandemic, and that is sort of a crystal ball. If we like mobility, we need to see where that is going to lead us and reorient our transport planning, our infrastructure planning and budgeting, and so on and so forth. But there's also something else about Bogota. In Bogota, we are starting to build railways articulated with the Transmilenio RT system of buses, which you well know. But this is an infrastructure network that is also supplemented by a system of public bikes that we will implement this year. We'll start managing that open bid process for that bike system. But there's this whole transformation and ambition to renew our fleet. The Transmilenio has been making huge progress in terms of how to remove from the fleet the very active, highly pollutant diesel bus, Euro 1, 2, or 3, and to change that fleet to gas units as trunk lines, but also nationally take it up to over 1,485 electric buses. Some are already operational and many will come to be operational. Plus, we have electric taxis as well, but also the freight fleet. So we have this whole ecosystem that is properly structured, but that it needs to implement actions so that we can comply with the objectives. As a city that is the capital of a country, a city with more than 8 million inhabitants, but if we consider the outer regions and people coming and commuting to Bogota, we can talk about 10 million inhabitants. And so there is a huge challenge when it comes to cutting down GHG emissions, to cutting down the sulfur particles of PM10, PM2.5. So these are the tools that we need. We need these results to sort of guide our policies to be able to plan, to execute the current development plan, but also to plan the next and future development plans and our master plans to be articulated with them. So we are very pleased. It's a pleasure for us to be here, to be listening to these results, and of course, to be able to guide and plan our great future. Thank you so much. Thank you, Juan Esteban, for these comments on investments and interventions that are planned in Bogota for the different transport modes. This is a great introduction for the ITF presentation that we will hear. And we're very excited to know that the Secretariat is already thinking how they will leverage all these planning tools. I will then switch into English.
The main findings for Bogota, as we were mentioning before. Today, we will have as speakers Joshua Paternina Blanco, who is a policy analyst at the ITF, working mostly under the framework of the ITF Decarbonising Transport initiative. And also we will have Dimitrios Papaionou, who is a transport modeler and analyst in the quantitative policy analysis and foresight unit in ITF and has been the lead modeler with this project. Thank you very much, Joshua, and Dimitris, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Lorraine. Thank you very much to all of the colleagues that have allowed us to get this far, particularly to the staff of the Mobility Secretariat of Bogota and colleagues from the IDB. So just to present very briefly what were some of the main actions that we undertook in the project, I'm first going to give a brief scope of the project activities for those of you who didn't have the opportunity to attend the session on Tuesday. I'm then going to highlight some of the main results from an initial policy overview that we carried on in the city. And then my colleague Dimitris is going to present some of the main results stemming from a quantitative assessment framework developed within this project for the Bogota region. So the DTLA project is a joint initiative, or was a joint initiative between 2019 and 2021 by the ITF and the IDB, which aimed at supporting authorities of different cities, in this case Bogota, for meeting their transport decarbonization objectives through three main work areas. The first one was assessing current policies and existing challenges for transport decarbonization, which led to the future publication of a policy report. The second one was the developing and the providing of a quantitative transport scenario assessment tool to inform policymakers of the impact of their planned and potential future policy actions for transport decarbonization. And this thanks to the development of a tool, but also of a scenario report, which is going to be published in the future. And finally, we also aimed at having a platform for peer learning and best practice exchange among the project cities and their authorities. And to this end, 3 in-person workshops were developed alongside technical trainings and a final event. Now, again, thank you very much for all of the help in these activities, without which this wouldn't have been possible. Just as a brief disclaimer, in the policy report, we speak about the Bogota region. As you will know, there is a region in legal construction, the Región Metropolitana Bogotá-Cundinamarca, but as the area and capacities of the region is still under discussion, this study actually refers to the area of coverage of Bogota DC's mobility survey, which includes the capital district of Bogota and 18 surrounding municipalities, making an emphasis on Bogota DC for both passenger transport especially, but also slightly freight transport. Now, first, tackling what are some of the main characteristics of the passenger transport system in Bogota. There are first good news for passenger transport, which is the fact that most trips, almost 7 out of 10 in the Bogota region, are done by sustainable modes, both active mobility and also public transport. And as you may know, there is a remarkable participation in cycling in the mobility share of the Bogota region. The share is thrice as much as Mexico cities, for instance, as my colleague made the point yesterday. And this is because of the ambition of the city to become the Capital Mundial de la Bici, or world's capital for cycling. Beyond active mobility promotion, authorities, as the representative from Bogota just mentioned, have highly invested in the presence of public transport, which represents over 30% of daily trips in the Bogota region. Now, this is being expanded both through investments in the metro system and the regional railway system, which has been developed and mentioned, but also through fleet replacement processes. And in spite of these advancements, there is still a participation of informal transport, which is a mode that brings access particularly to lower income areas of the cities. So overall, these are good news for transport decarbonization. However, we still need to highlight the fact that in a city with high income inequality, such as Bogota, of course, mobility behavior also varies according to economic tier or estrato. In this graph, you can see the mode share for different income tiers in the city, from the lowest 1 and the highest 6. And what we can see is that generally lower income groups walk 2 times more and use public transport, more than 4 times more than that of higher income groups. Now, on the opposite, the highest income strata has a high participation of private modes. Almost 1 in 2 trips are done by private modes. This is not to say that lower income groups do not use private vehicles. There is a worrying trend of adoption of motorcycles among lower income tiers, which is a Colombian trend, but also a sign of low access and affordability by public transport, which makes people go into motorcycles. Now that we've mentioned some characteristics of the passenger transport activities, let's look at the freight one. When it comes to freight, what we need to understand is the fact that urban logistics in the Bogota region activities are more and more complex as time goes by. Activities are focused especially within the Bogota capital district. And over time, what we see, and you can see this reflected in the graph, is that transported volumes decrease, but the amount of trips increases, which is a worrying sign, of course, of decreased operational efficiencies, and which is an area of concern for transport decarbonization. Now, this can be due to many factors, but one of them is the atomization of freight because of the presence of nano stores in Bogota, DC. Now, a second worrying trend is the apparition of new modes for last mile delivery, especially in informal areas such as bicycles. And this is promoted by the appearance of new actors in mobility such as Rappi. Now that we've looked at some of the main characteristics, let's look at the existing policy framework. When it comes to the policy framework, there is, and this is a positive point, very comprehensive policy framework at both the national and the local levels to first promote avoiding unnecessary trips, both passenger and freight, also shifting existing trips towards more sustainable modes, and finally, at improving existing technologies. And just looking at the passenger transport activities, when it comes to avoid, both authorities at the national and local levels are promoting programs that support transport-oriented development, and this aligns transport and land use planning. When it comes to shifting, there is an emphasis on having a mode shift away from cars and towards sustainable mobility, such as cycling, both through vehicle restrictions schemes, but also through investments in cycling lanes. Finally, both at the national and local levels, there are ambitious programs that aim at incentivizing fleet electrification at both levels. Now, there are some areas of improvements which are discussed at length in the report. 2 of them are the following. First, there is an existing carbon tax in the country, but this carbon tax does not extend to coal. And as international demand for coal decreases, and there is a risk for an increased adoption of coal for the energy matrix of the country, then extending this carbon tax to coal could help ensuring that electrification is actually sustainable. Then it could be useful to explicit final transport decarbonization goals at the local and national levels for 2030 and beyond, as well as aligning policy documents in this context. But now that we've tackled some of the policy framework, let's look at the 4 main challenges that we've highlighted in the city. First, as briefly mentioned, there is a major increase of private vehicle use, both for car ownership and for motorcycle ownership and use. This means that electrification will not be enough for facing the increase in private vehicle use. Because of this, it's necessary to enhance public transport provision, but not only for decarbonization objectives, but also for equity ones. If we see in the map, public transport in some areas in Bogota currently brings access to less than 20% of all available jobs within the Bogota region. So increasing public transport provision also responds to equity objectives. For all of these, there is the necessity of developing new funding streams, as well as partnering up with private actors for financing required investments. Now, if we look at challenges for freight, there is a main challenge, which is increasing multimodality and better managing flows. For For both objectives, private cooperation is a must. Now, most emissions in freight transport come from road transport activity, and these emissions are set to increase majorly in the future. To face this, it's necessary to promote sustainable multimodality. And now there are various pilots being developed by city authorities to promote this shift, such as one, which is BC Cargos, that you can see in the slide. Attention would need to be paid to both decarbonization benefits, but also other areas such as road safety concerning this line. Now, cooperation with private actors, as I mentioned, is going to be key for understanding and better managing urban freight operations, as well as to reducing the age of the fleet. And we can see that the Bogota authorities have brokered agreements with freight fleet vehicle owners operating in the capital to this end. So this could be further in the future. Now, there is a third challenge, which is aligning decarbonization and air quality objectives. Air quality is a major policy concern in Bogota region, in spite of major improvements in decrease of local pollutant emissions. Now, many activities aiming at reducing these emissions are tackling the freight transport activities, which are the main source of transport emissions in the city, through measures such as vehicle restrictions, which have had varying results in passenger transport, but then when it comes to freight transport, these have been mostly positives. It's going to be necessary to keep aligning these goals. And when it comes to other measures, such as the development of transit-oriented developments, there needs to be attention to how these two goals aligned. There have been studies that show that if there is not a fleet replacement for a high-capacity public transport network, then areas around transport stations could have high concentrations of local pollutants, which could be a danger for public health. So these two goals could be aligned by better fleet replacement and having cleaner fleet technologies. And final slide, please. Thank you. Just as a last mention, as I mentioned at the beginning, there is currently a transformation in metropolitan transport governance in the Bogota region. Right now, there is not a clear and effective governance framework, but this could be improved through the opportunity opened up by the metropolitan Cundinamarca and Bogota region, which is currently being developed and clarified. The main message that I would like to convey is that an effective metropolitan transport authority could include the following characteristics, which have both strategic and integrated multimodal transport planning, also include the capacity for planning public transport infrastructure, service and fares, and also includes other elements such as traffic demand management and road safety. I was also mentioned by Nestor Roa at the beginning. So these elements are going to be clarified in the future as well. But for the time being, I will give the floor to my colleague Dimitris. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joshua. So now we will proceed with the results that came out of the modeling work that we undertook. Before we jump into defining the scenarios, I just want to show you the zone system that we have used for this work. So as Joshua mentioned, the basis for our work comes from a mobility survey, and the zoning system that was defined was decided alongside with the mobility secretariat of Bogota DC, and we have 32 zones. You can see it's a bit they're smaller within Bogota, and we have also seven zones that cover the Cundinamarca department. Now, these zones are the level in which the policies have an effect. We have some policies that are effective at the zone level, some that are effective in the whole city level, and of course, when we are talking about public transport infrastructure, they are affecting in a zone pair level between zone 1 and zone 2. Now, together with the Bogota authorities, back in August, if I remember correctly, we designed two scenarios. The two scenarios were meant to represent two possible futures for the region of for the study region. Of course, they are not fixed. They do not signify something, but we still set up with those two scenarios. The first one is the current policy scenarios, which includes the stated plans and the ambitions of the current administration. Of course, as administrations often rely on election cycles, it's much more focused on the short term. It becomes less explicit when we go beyond 2030, but there are still measures that take place later on. Now, obviously, the scenarios are much more complicated than what is shown here, but if we would group the main highlights, there is a lot of infrastructure developments, especially in the short term, in the next decade. This comes both in the form of public transport. As has been mentioned, there is the metro system that is currently under construction. There are several BRT corridors, and also the Regio tram that will connect Bogota to certain parts of Cundinamarca. But also, there will be improvements in non-motorized infrastructure, mainly in the city center. Then when it comes to policies, this scenario includes a peak hour car restriction system for the entirety of Bogota. And it also includes a trend. It has been mentioned how motorcycles are an issue for Bogota. So in this scenario, we assume that motorcycle usage will continue to grow. And it will continue to grow even also, not only in absolute numbers, but also in share. Last but not least, regarding fleet electrification targets, for the private car sales, it is assumed that 2050, only 20% of new vehicles sold will be electric, whereas for public transport, vehicles will have a shift to natural gas vehicles before starting to switch towards electric. So this is the current policy scenarios, which is the first scenario that we tested. And in contrast, we have the positive scenario. So this scenario builds up on the previous one. You can see here in bold the additional thing. So there is a higher ambition embedded in this scenario. Much of the things are the same, but we do have more medium-term measures such as new policies and reversal of some trends. So when it comes to infrastructure, beyond what is already included, we also have a second metro line or an expansion of the first. We have new BRT systems and more Regio tram lines. Non-motorized infrastructures will also expanding from the city center of Bogota also to some of the outer parts of the city. When it comes to policies, this car restriction scheme will apply for the whole day. It will not be limited in peak hour, but there will also be a suite of other policies that regulate parking costs, or there will be a congestion charging scheme put in place. When it comes to trends, it is assumed in this scenario that motorcycle usage is controlled. It remains at similar levels as what we have today, but on the other hand, cycling becomes much more common and widespread. Finally, when it comes to the electrification targets are much more ambitious. In this scenario, by 2050, 95% of all new vehicles, new private cars sold are electric. And when it comes to public transport, we have a much faster shift to electric buses and BRTs. And by 2050, the public transport in Bogota will be fully electrified. Now, let's look into some of the results that came out of these scenarios. Now, this first graph talks about trip growth. So there is a growth assumed in both scenarios. The number of trips could grow by as much as 40%. That is in the current policy scenarios. In the positive scenario, a small degree of teleworking is assumed, so that slightly reduces the number of the growth in the number of trips. But as the number of trips practically grows from the rising population and GDP levels, this is something that's a bit harder to avoid. Now, looking at the mode share, and this is mode share in trips, by number of trips, we see that in the current policy scenarios, we do not see a very significant change in the mode balance. If you see, and I'm not going to expand a lot because Joshua mentioned these numbers for the base year, so 2018 in this case, but as we see in 2050, we do have small changes. We do see a slight increase in car usage, which is of course also, there is also the slightly bigger increase of motorcycle motorcycle trips. And on the other hand, we do have a reduction of walking trips. So we can see, as you can see from these figures here, walking non-motorized modes are a very significant, play a very significant role in the transport ecosystem of Bogota and the surrounding region. Now, in the second scenario, in the positive scenario, we do see a change. So through the number of policies that are put in place, we do have a reduction in the private car use, and through the controlling of the trend, the share of motorcycle remains the same. So overall, public transport usage decreases. At the same time, we see that cycling more than doubles. So the number of trips that are done by cycling is actually triple when we're looking this at absolute numbers. Now, of course, when you're having such an increase in a mode, this has an effect, sometimes could be unintended, which we can see that there are fewer trips done with public transport. Obviously, some of these bike trips come from former public transport trips. Now, as I mentioned, the policies that we have and these trends are for the entire city, but the measures that we have do impact specific zones. So here in these maps, you see the different zones of Bogota, DC, and the surrounding region. And what we are seeing is whether the mode share of sustainable modes increases or decreases. So sustainable modes in this analysis are non-motorized, so walking and cycling, and public transport. And on the other hand, non-sustainable modes are private car, motorcycle, and taxi. So on the ones that come by orange are there is a reduction of the sustainable mode, so a growth in private vehicle use. So we can see that the current policy scenarios does have a much bigger growth on non-sustainable modes, whereas in the policy scenario, we see the opposite. We see a growth in sustainable modes. Of course, this is largely underpinned by the trends that work on the back, but at the same time, the different measures that we have could play a big role. For example, when we're looking at cycling, as we saw overall in the city, cycling grows by as much as 7%, and this is even bigger in zones where cycling measures are put in place, such as new cycling lanes or bike sharing systems. Now, evaluating activity by trips gives some interesting information, but it disregards the distance that is the distance that comes for each trip. So, for example, if we're evaluating activity in terms of passenger kilometers, we'll see that non-motorized modes lose part of their importance. That is, of course, because the trip distance that usually is done by a non-motorized mode is shorter. And this really shows the impact of public transport. So in the base year, about half of all passenger kilometers traveled were done by public transport. Private car, in comparison, does about 1 in 5, 20%. So as we see during the study period and going 2050, obviously the growth follows the absolute growth in number of trips. So there is a bigger growth in the current policy scenarios compared with the positive scenarios. But this is also because the different policies that encourage people to shift in shorter trips, such as land use policies and transit-oriented development. Now, within public transport, currently all of Bogota, or a vast majority of Bogota public transport, is done by buses or BRTs. As the new metro system is added, and some of the new Regio tram lines are incorporated in the system, the buses do lose importance over time. Now, switching over to CO2 emissions, we can see that both scenarios have a reduction in short-term emissions. So in the next decade, emissions are forecasted to reduce, so that is good news. But however, we can see how in the positive scenario, the additional measures that are taken, especially measures that restrict private vehicle usage and the increased adoption of electric vehicles, do have a much bigger impact. So by 2050, we have a reduction of almost 90%. So that shows the big potential that exists in the city of Bogota and the study region in general. Talking about vehicle fleet, let me just, the model also allows to estimate what is the amount of vehicles needed and what is the composition of those vehicles needed. The graph here on the right shows only the private car fleet. So we can see that in both scenarios, the number of cars is expected to grow. However, the big difference will be the composition. So in the current policy scenarios, you see that the majority of vehicles, 60%, the majority of vehicles will be low emission vehicles. So a lot of them will be hybrid, and as some 20% or 15% will be electric. However, there is still a significant number of internal combustion vehicles in the fleet. By contrast, in the positive scenario, there is a smaller growth of also on the total number of private cars, but almost 80% of them are electric. And in 2050, as I mentioned, all the new vehicles sold have zero direct emissions. Now, when it comes to public transport, I mentioned this on the scenarios, we do have a shift away from diesel in both scenarios. In the current policy scenarios, there is an increased use of natural gas as a transition fuel before shifting to electric. So by 2050, there are still some vehicles that have emissions from natural gas. However, in the positive scenario, all the public transport fleet is electrified. And now let me close with some conclusions and some recommendations that come from this work. Let me start with private vehicles. So there is a projected growth that is expected to come, so that could potentially amplify congestion issues if not managed, and this is something that we see in the current policy scenario. We do have increased transport streams coming from outside of Bogota, from the Cundinamarca region. That is, as the population there is expected to grow, and the economic growth gives these people the option to buy private vehicles that could be cars or motorcycles. So that would be something that Bogota will need to deal with in the future. So in the positive scenarios, we saw how policies that penalize or restrict car usage can actually control and reverse this growth. Now, when it comes to public transport, the two scenarios show the importance of continuous investment in the system, both to enhance it and to extend it. We've seen how short-term developments have an impact in the short term, but also having plans for the long term is key to continue expanding and making public transport attractive and a realistic option for more people. It is also important to point out that as the metro system will gradually be introduced in Bogota, that will probably require a realignment of the existing network, because the new system will probably work differently than the one operating today. Now, non-motorized modes, Bogota is a very dense city, I believe one of the densest in the continent. So this density does favor short trips, so we can see how we have a high number of walking trips and cycling trips. So obviously that is something that should be encouraged. So supporting the growth of non-motorized mode with policies and infrastructure can amplify this effect. And it's also important to put in place land use policies that could provide solutions down the line. Land use policies tend to be slow, tend to produce their results at a medium time frame, not right away, but they're still important to be considered. And finally, my last slide, talking about CO2 emissions, it is very positive that we do see a descending trajectory. So the policies that have been adopted or plan to be adopted in the short term do have a positive impact in reducing CO2 emissions. However, it is important that Bogota adopts policies that restrict the use of polluting modes and enable zero emission mobility. This could be the version of low emission zones or car restriction schemes. So these have been proven where they have been tested in the world that they actually do have an impact. Now, Finally, regarding the vehicle fleet, of course, this will have to be part of the solution in any urban environment. Electric vehicles will be needed, and they will drastically reduce the emissions both for public and private fleets. As the government has direct control over the public fleets, either publicly owned vehicles or public transport, it is important that they go fast and they go strong, and they try to electrify the fleet as soon as possible, because also vehicles that are purchased now are likely to have a lifespan of 10, 15, 20 years. So decisions made today will have an impact 20 years from now. And of course, when it comes also to the private individuals, you cannot force people to buy the cars you want. So it would be important to provide incentives and to put in place policies that can encourage the adoption and the purchase of electric vehicles. And before closing up, I would also like to thank everyone who was involved in this project, particularly our colleagues from the IDB, and also the colleagues from the Mobility Secretariat of Bogota, and particularly two people who really helped us, Maria Carolina and Lina Marcela, who were there providing us a lot of information and giving us answers to all the questions we had. And with this, I pass the floor back to Laureen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dimitris and Josh.
As we saw in these previous sessions, Bogota has similar challenges in terms of the transport activity, and it's more concerning in terms of the potential growth of private cars, private cars and motorcycles. But some of our panel members have already mentioned this in previous sessions, and you even actually mentioned it in your presentation. The challenge is then to how we respond to the challenge of the growth of that derivated or derived demand, not only in terms of environmental sustainability, but also financial and economic sustainability of systems in general, and also remembering social dimensions and the equality objectives that a transport system should aim for. I forgot to introduce myself at the beginning. I'm Laureen Montes. I am an expert of the IADB, and I will be moderating a panel with our local experts. From the Mobility Secretariat, we have Lina Marcela Quiñones. She is the Director of Intelligence for Mobility. She is an environmental engineer and an economist with a master's degree in urbanization and development. We will also hear Ricardo Delgado. He's the advisor of the District Environment Secretariat for the Climate Action Plan implementation. He's an electrical engineer. He has a master's degree and a PhD in electrical engineering. From the bank side, we will hear Gibet Camos. She is a transport senior specialist representing the IADB in Colombia. She's also an engineer, and she has a master's degree in transport. We will also hear Darío Hidalgo. He is an independent researcher and mobility advisor who has over 30 years of experience in the public sector, in academia, in NGOs, and also working as a consultant for the Latin American Development Bank. We will also hear someone from Transmilenio, Sofia Sarama. She is the head of planning and deputy manager of business development of Transmilenio S.A. To begin with this panel discussion, we will pick up on the results explained by the ITF team, making the most of the fact that most of the panelists we have here today were not directly involved in the creation of the baseline scenarios and the positive scenarios. So I would like to start by asking you, what are your first reactions to these scenarios that have been presented? Do you believe that these are realistic enough, or are we perhaps disregarding or leaving out some important aspects? Perhaps we could begin with Sofia Sarama from Transmilenio. We would also remind you all that you can leave your questions in the Q&A section in the bottom bar, and we will be answering them during the discussion or in the Q&A moment. Sophia, you have the floor. Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you to the IADB, to IFT. The work that we have seen is extremely interesting. Us at Transmilenio, we are excited to have this tool that will make it possible for us to measure the impact of the measures that we implement in the system. We really welcome the results. We believe that they respond to the effort that we are carrying out from our entity for promoting the technological upgrade of our fleet. From 2018 to today, we have made substantial changes in terms of standards of emission and technology within the system. As you know, we have the trunk line component of the system, which are the BRT buses. With regards to those buses, in 2018, we did a long haul renovation. We went from 1,160 buses with Euro 2 emission standards and Euro 3 as well, to having 1,142 buses, out of which 51% are powered by natural gas, the Euro 6 standard, and 49% are diesel powered Euro 5 emission with a particulate matter filter. So this not only meant quite a lot of progress in terms of the increase of capacity in the system, but also in terms of the emissions reduction. The trunk line component is not the one that contributes the most to the pie of the mobile components transport. As of our inventory in 2018, this component accounted for 1.4% of that total in terms of particulate matter. And with this refurbishment of our fleet, we went down to 0.3% in the share. So this renewable in terms of particulate matter meant a reduction of about 16 tons of particulate matter, which is considerable. And it goes along the line with the results that have been presented in terms of reduction. As for the zonal or zone component, those blue buses that go through the city, we also have had considerable progress, particularly in the promotion of electrification. From 2018 to date. We have held selection process, so we now have 1,483 electric buses, which meant putting out of service 2,124 buses that complied with Euro 2 and Euro 3 standards. So this means that we cut down 43 tons of particulate matter. And this, of course, is aligned to the results that we have been shown. We will continue to work, we will continue to grow in this public transport integrated system of the city. We will continue to promote zero emission technologies, and we will thus then contribute to achieving this goal that is not only a mobility goal, but also an environmental goal. Thank you, Sophia. What a great thought that you provided about the integration between the total and trunk line sectors and systems to total emissions. So that we can continue to talk about that later. We will now hear Darío Hidalgo. Darío, tell me about your reactions with regards to these scenarios. First of all, I would like to thank you all. This is a very strong team, ITF, Joshua, Demetrius, Stephen, Elizabeth, and in IADB and the ITF, Laureen. Thank you so much for moderating this panel, Nestor, Ernesto, who have worked in this, and from the district side, Juan Esteban, Aline, Nicolás, Maria Carolina, Yoira, and I would say Sophia as well, who keeps working on this with Esteban and Ricardo from the Environment Secretariat. All of you and all of us show that this scenario is quite optimistic. It's a great optimistic scenario that the city is struggling, but is making an effort to achieve. But this can go down the drain at any point. So our biggest effort is to carry on the public policies that Bogota has been pushing and can be sustained in the future. So the support that we get from your model exercise is extremely important. Bogota is currently discussing the territorial organization plan, and it will be essential that the goals that we set in terms of modal partition can become a part of the plan. Currently, the plan is a bit thin when it comes to specific goals on how we're going to move, and hopefully the Secretariat of Mobility and the Secretariat of Environment and Planning Secretariat as well can actually include those goals to see how we can take it from the scenario, not only for the short term, but for the next 12 years. So we can at least maintain that modal partition. That is hard. It's hard to achieve, but we will hopefully reach it. The baseline scenario is optimistic, and we see that there is a considerable drop, but not the kind of drop that we need. We need to have a positive scenario, which is a very demanding scenario that we will need to work a lot on to achieve it and to hold on to it. You know, the public transport trips, pedestrian trips, bike rides. We need to work a lot to improve the quality, even though we have renewed the fleet, but we need to continue to improve the quality. We need to improve the cycling infrastructure, and I'm sure that Lina will mention those efforts later on. But we have to do something that perhaps is not quite clear yet, and I think we need to highlight this. We need to manage that demand. We need to manage that growth that you see in the use of private cars and motorcycles. And we will not only have to promote the change to an electric fleet, we need to be harder and stronger with this. And currently we may not have the tools to do this at the district level. So we need to talk to the national government, but we also have to encourage the reduction of use. So we're talking about charges by congestion, by pollution, charges that can actually are geared towards decarbonizing the transport, but also at achieving the other goals. Bogota is appearing at international indexes as the most congested city in the world. And we have people saying that we have to solve congestion, but we know if we work in this that we haven't solved it. We need to provide alternatives to car use, but we will see a lot of and face a lot of pressure to solve congestion in the next few years, because we will keep seeing Bogota in the top places in those complex indexes that only measure mobility in terms of cars. But we need to move towards a change that maintains and increases this trend. And I'm a bit afraid, and I'm just being honest here, I'm a bit afraid about the fact that we might deviate from this public policy when incentivizing electric cars, because we will not solve that problem. It will solve some pollution, GHG emissions and pollutant and emissions problems, but it will not solve inequality problems, and it will not solve the congestion that we're so concerned about, and it will not solve road incidents and traffic incidents, which is something that is concerning for us. So we need to make the most of these models to measure and to try to find the reflection of other objectives. It's not so hard, because we do have the vehicles per kilometer, and then we can do calculations of accidents per vehicle per kilometer. So we can then do relatively easy calculations to assess the local pollutant emissions. Perhaps it is a bit more difficult to measure equality. Thank you. Thank you, Dario. I think you really joined all the dots that we have been talking about in recent sessions to what Juan Esteban mentioned at the beginning, the need to accelerate the implementation of all those policies that are currently being developed, and also with what Nestor mentioned, and what we do with all that huge demand of cars. It's not just a matter of changing from internal combustion vehicles to electrical vehicles. You can see in social media very interesting graphs where you can see, lanes full of electric cars and internal combustion cars, but the equality problem is still there. The gender problem is still there. Perhaps we can then, Dario, talk a bit about congestion charges later on, and how those need to be accompanied with short-term policies to ensure greater success. I will then give the floor to Jibet. Jibet, the same question. Could you tell us about your reactions to the scenarios? And perhaps, Jibet, you could go deep into a problem and a question that was proposed to us, and how to use funding resources to achieve the scenarios that were presented, and how to get financial assistance. So this has been a constant question in all this week's events, the need of cities to get the funding to finance decarbonization policies. Tibet, you have the floor. Thank you, Laureen. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of this panel. For me, it's a pleasure to be here with all these other panel members from Bogota. As Juan Esteban mentioned at the beginning, we have been working with all of you with a lot of passion, because we are really passionate about the challenges posed by the urban mobility system in Bogota and the opportunities that we are now being given in this pandemic context, which is already 1 year old. So first of all, I would like to thank the organizers, my colleagues from the IADB, Doreen, and the ITF for organizing this event and this study, which can provide interesting contributions for Bogota and other cities in the region. And in terms of the reaction to the study that you have shown from Bogota, what I think is that it is very interesting to see the figures of the impact, of the projected impact, because those figures make it possible to make it concrete. And I would like to mention something along the lines to what Juan Esteban said. Some of the measures that we're working on in Colombia with Bogota City, with the Mobility Secretariat, and also some other measures that we're working on at the national level with the national government, because some of them we believe that can have a strong, considerable impact in the development of urban mobility in Colombian cities. In the case of Bogota, we are working to develop the first metro line for Bogota. We are working on the opportunities to improve the operation of the city's public transport system. We have heard Sophia talking about all the progresses that they have made in terms of fleet. And we also believe that the public operator project in Bogota that is being developed and that we are supporting will then have a very positive impact with regards to everything that has been presented today. As Sophia mentioned, all the projects in terms of electric mobility for mass transport systems. And we also believe that the strategies related to ride shares and smart charges can be opportunities to get funding. And lastly, everything that has been done in terms of urban logistics. Here we have certain interesting initiatives that we're working on with Bogota, for example, some related to e-commerce and the last mile. So in this regard, we're working with the national government to articulate logistic corridors so that we can analyze the measures that our cities take to understand their own problems. So with regards to the study itself, Laureen, perhaps I'd like to mention 3 aspects. First, I'm more optimistic than Dario, I think, because I believe that knowing the different projects that are being promoted from the city of Bogota and have been promoted for a year or more than a year, I would think that reality can actually be a bit more optimistic than the baseline scenario that we were shown before. In terms of cyclist infrastructure, the ITF colleagues mentioned it, but we have the Ciclo Alameda Medio Milenio project and these green corridor strategy that are being promoted are ambitious policies, and they have a wide scope, and we'll see how Bogota was actually doing better than other cities in this regard. So we also believe that the city goals in terms of incorporating or electrifying the public transport are ambitious. And Sophia mentioned, these figures of including 1,485 electric buses. And I think that that is an actual figure, and it's more optimistic than that baseline scenario. And finally, I would also like to say that in the case of Bogota, we have already implemented a congestion charge, which will evolve or eventually evolve to smart charges. So as a first topic or first reaction to this study that we've just seen, we believe that this set of measures shows a baseline scenario that already contains interesting policies. And I'm sorry, but I think I'm a bit more optimistic than the Rio, but what he said was also very important. The second thing that I wanted to highlight with regards to what was mentioned before and for the case of Bogota is the importance of freight transport. The impact of freight transport is huge in the urban structure of the city, and the presentation of the study clearly says that freight transport is the most polluting transport, and it emits about 40% of particulate matter to the air in the city. So that is why I think it's necessary to be more stern in recommending policies that are aimed at decarbonizing, particularly freight transport, and include specific measures that analyze the positive impact or the positive scenario impact. The results of this scenario don't seem achievable if we don't truly consider and focus on freight transport. And likewise, it is one of the areas that in which Bogota will have to design and implement more ambitious policies. So I do think that it must be said in terms of freight transport, well, we have still a long way to go that can go in the direction that you were saying. Lastly, what I wanted to say as a reaction to the study is related to the increasing use of motorcycles, not only in Bogota, but in other Colombian cities. We are all reacting to that study. We know this challenge that is not only faced by Bogota, but many Colombian cities and regional cities, and we know the terrible effects that it has in pollution, in road safety, accidents, and the impact on the sustainability of public transport systems that we are seeing actually the drop in the demand levels, as well as the circulation conditions in these congested cities. So here, this maybe ties up to the question from the participants. We believe that it is essential to work in management measures to manage private demand. It is a huge challenge to design these kind of policies that may be accepted by the citizens, because of course you need to consider people accepting these policies and political representatives and user groups accepting these policies. So in a positive scenario, we suggest controlling the amount of motorcycles that go through the city. And I have to remind you that motorcycles is the main tool for work for many people in Bogota. So we have to consider this. This is a challenge that we need to take into consideration when we prepare a policy like this for the city. Another challenge would be the implementation of pico y placa in the cities that have negative externalities, we see, for example, the increase of cars in the cities. So that is why we believe that it will be essential for Bogota and other larger intermediate cities in Colombia to design these policies based on actual real data. So a study like the one that was presented to us will be essential for us to have real actual data and preference surveys, and considering the social dimension that this sustainable mobility problem has. Thank you, Laureen.
Excellent, Javed. I also highlight the figures and data. We all have suffered when we work in transport. Data are scarce. So I totally agree with you that this type of tool based on real data, specific data that allow us to build a business case and the need to move forward this urgent agenda are very relevant. Also, Javed, I also want to highlight from what you said, urban freight transportation. Joshua introduced the subject, especially when he talked about the political and policy context, but within the model, this topic has not been fully taken into account. Maybe this is a next area to work. Dimitrios, and it was very interesting what Jibet was saying, to think how to adapt these policies when we're talking about small or intermediate cities, and also to highlight motorbikes as a source of employment, or as Joshua showed in the beginning, an accessibility to jobs map due to public transport. This is also something that we did in cooperation with ITF. We have those maps estimated for cars. The difference is radical, the number of jobs that you can have access to potentially. So that is also something relevant to take into account. I would now like to give the floor to the environmental secretariat of the district so that Ricardo can talk about the reactions to the scenarios. Thank you very much for this invitation. The results have been very interesting and the contributions of the panelists. The first thing I have to say is that I am surprised, positively surprised, that is, the exploration of this positive scenario, which is the one when for the first time we are observing that there is a mode of transportation that has been quantifying a trajectory to zero emissions in 2050. That seen and generated by the environment, but not by the environment secretariat. It's a very important result. Does that not happen at the national level? When you look at the planning of the transportation secretary or the Ministry of Energy, the climatic criteria is not necessarily reflected. Here we are observing a scenario in which we see a positive trend that is aligned and that were done separately with the city's climate action plan. We have three targets regarding greenhouse effect, a reduction of 15% of the baseline. Second, a reduction of 50% for 2030 vis-a-vis the baseline, and that goal is shared with the central region of the country, with the Cundinamarca department as well, and the carbon neutrality for 2050. What is interesting here is to see that in the calculations we have estimated reasonable trajectories for the positive scenario that led to substantial decrease in the emissions of the transport and freight sectors for 2050. Those reductions would be aligned with the goals of the climatic action plan of the city. So this is very favorable, that is to say, to have this kind of analysis, and also very useful to have this tool to be able to follow up and monitor the transformations that will lead to the fulfillment of the emission reduction on the city. What is also very important is that this exercise allows us to do a long-term estimation on the future of mobility, and that long-term scenario is relevant because we need to understand that by 2050, for different reasons, public mobility in the city and large part of the public cars will be done with zero-emission vehicles. So the investments in infrastructure to support that zero-emission mobility will have a quick investment rate, but a long span. So if you want to build the charge plants for the electric buses that are now coming to Bogota, will be used after 15, 20 years, because into 2050 will be necessary still. And that is a good sign that will also allow to implement these investments that are necessary for the infrastructure changes to leverage this electrification of the transport. This is in the case of public transport, but also something similar would apply for private transport. In this PAC exercise, the Environment Secretary interacted with the Mobility Secretariat to identify the mitigation strategies, many of them reflected in the results that we are observing today, that will lead for the emissions related to the Mobility Secretariat would be reduced according to the PAC goals. 38% of the greenhouse emissions of the city, including the indirect emissions created outside the city in the generation of electricity, 48% of those emissions correspond to the road transport in Bogota. That is 48%. When we look at how the mitigation of these greenhouse gases is done, not all mitigations correspond to mitigations that can be implemented from mobility or the Mobility Secretariat. We need interactions, as Dario mentioned, with the Secretariat of Planning. We need interactions, and we have found out that we need interactions with organizations that you wouldn't think that are directly related, such as the Women's Secretariat. They have a crucial role in these transformations because right now, most of the bike users are men. And what we have sensed is that the increase in that mode participation will be triggered by the selection of bicycles as a means of transportation for women. So this Secretariat of Women has a great relevance there. Also the Secretariat of Education to support the transformation of mobility, because the selection of the means of transportation in 10 or 20 years will be done by the students that are now in schools and high schools. So as they are in school or high school, in 10 or 15 years, they will be able to choose which means of transportation they will use. And among their preferences that will guide their choices, we should teach them about environmental sustainability, the efficacy and efficiency as part of the selection process of public means of transportations, and of course, changes in the perceptions and consumption of present students. So in all these mode changes issues, it is relevant to work with Secretariat of Education and the Secretariat of Culture as well. Finally, I see that regarding the feasibility of the scenarios that we are analyzing for the long term, there is a clear signal for the long term aligned with the city government, and we are also clearly aligned from the City Council of Bogota, because the mandates are clearly established to guide these transformations. And the national government is also aligned and has announced its goals for the mitigations of greenhouse emissions by mid-century. The strategy is about to be launched. Regarding the Paris Agreement, so the transformation of the other sectors are also aligned. The electricity that the city will use has to be renewable, has to be low emissions, so that electrification makes sense. And happily, there is an alignment also with the national government at the national level, which is the one that controls the electric system and of the nation. And they also want to migrate to a lower emission system, if not carbon neutral. So the scenarios, even the positive scenario, although very challenging, this could be done overnight. Well, probably no, but it has a logics. we have different rules in play, but the long-term scenario allows us to start planning the adjustments in policies, contracts, habits in different sectors that are required to meet the targets. This scenario, I believe, is feasible, very challenging, but I believe it is feasible. And it is aligned with the climate action plan of the Secretariat. Great, Ricardo, very interesting what you said about sending the right incentives to the private sector to foster those investments that would leverage electromobility, and that is along the lines of the reflections about reviewing the sources of electricity. So I would also wanted to profit from what you said in the beginning of your intervention about the different interventions of the different institutions of the public sector. This is not only mobility, this is also environment, gender, culture, education to implement these planning exercises. And that's why I would like to give the floor to Lina now, because she has been the right hand and has been deeply involved in the spreading of these scenarios. Any reflection along this last line of cooperation among different public institutions and collaboration with the private sector as well, mentioned both by Ricardo and Dario? Thank you, Lorraine. In the first place, I wanted to thank you all for your invitation and for all the work. Thank you to the ITF and IDB. It is really a very interesting and useful tool. Very easy to use, which is something that we really value because we will be interacting with this a lot. It has been very interesting for us. I can highlight many things that you have said. I will start with your last question, the interaction between the different sectors of the district or government. And it's something that we have been doing quite a lot in mobility with the environment. We have been working hand in hand. Our goals are aligned with the climate action plan. We are developing public policies together for motorized mobility of low or zero emissions, and we have also involving environment for the bicycle public policy that gathers a great number of sectors like culture, women, economic development, many sectors that are involved in the process in the promotion of bicycle that we have been fostering from the administration of the district, especially from the mobility secretariat. And then I wanted to talk about something else that I found interesting, which is, and looking at the results of the models, is the mode participation, the mode share that we see there. We see a great increase in the use of bicycles, which is our goal, which is something that we're aiming at to double the mode share. But I want to draw your attention about the mobility patterns that we're observing today. We are already seeing a high increase in the share of bicycle use due partly to the pandemic, to the aversion that people might have to public transport, and of course, to the provision of new cycling lanes or temporary cycle lanes. 20 to 30% of the people that uses those cycling lanes used to use public transport. It's good, but it's not so good to lose so many people from public transport because this preference for individual modes is something that worries us. But within those users, 5% are coming from individual motorized uses, from motorbikes or cars. So that part is rather interesting. And maybe that trend is the one that we can reinforce. I was also noticing that Ricardo said that he sees that positive scenario as a quite feasible one, and that in the presentation last Monday, I don't know if you all attended, but we saw that Bogotá seemed the most optimistic city of all the three, an increase in kilometers per passenger and a reduction, a very steep reduction in greenhouse emissions. So it really seemed that we were truly optimistic. No, but the thing is that this is aligned with the policies that we are already designing, with the plans that we're implementing, and even with the situation that we're facing currently. As Joshua mentioned in the beginning, today, Bogota has a mode distribution that is very sustainable. 7 out of 10 trips are done sustainably. If we compare that with other cities, for example, London, they have the target of 80% of sustainable trips for 2041. And we are today standing at 70%. So really, Bogota has a very good starting point. We have the challenges that Dario mentioned, which is to have this mode sharing or mode share to continue, and that it to be voluntary, that people choose to walk. And that's why we are developing several strategies to improve the walkability conditions of the city, to improve the conditions of the use of bicycles, and of course, of public transport. And here I want to go back to something Gibet said, and it also came through the questions of the audience, how to finance these scenarios. Well, of course, we have these targets, we're developing these policies, these plans, and where is the money coming from? Well, I totally agree with what Gibet said. What we have seen in the best international practices, cities that have really moved forward in this, what we try is to start to internalize the externalities created by private vehicles, traffic, accidents, to review also the costs of parking, and to review the requirements for parking. This is something that is not a competence of the mobility sector, but is an indirect subsidy to the use of private vehicles. So we have to start looking at that and to manage that demand to be able to finance the more sustainable investments. We see that Madrid, only 40% of the cost of the public transport system is financed with tariffs, and the rest is alternate sources that many times come from these holders associated to the management of demand. So that's really important to start working in that direction. Two other issues that were mentioned that interest me. One is in regional integration, which is truly really important and something very valuable that in this model was also included the surrounding municipalities and the Department of Cundinamarca, because of course, and what data shows, Bogota and the nearing municipalities have a lot of common mobility, is both in terms of passengers and freight. So sometimes we plan our cities or we manage our cities as they were islands, and that is not possible. Also in terms of environment, not only in terms of greenhouse emissions or air quality, what happens in Bogota affects the surrounding municipalities and vice versa. So if policies of emission control, of vehicle registration are different outside the city, which as in the city, it affects everything that happens in the city. So those are other things that we can work on from the district and in regional integration. All the plans that we have, we are also focusing at the whole region. Dario mentioned that he was worried that public policies for electric mobility was too focused in incentives to electric cars and motorcycles. We want to clarify that it's not like that. It is a step that we consider necessary, that the trips that have to be done in motorized vehicles and are not in public transport to be done in cleaner vehicles. But of course, we have this large approach of aiming at modal change to reduce the need of trips, of necessary or mandatory trips. And finally, to improve technologies, and something that drew my attention of the model is that the great reduction of greenhouse effect gases was observed through the improvements in technology. So as Sofia said, it's something that we are moving forward in. So everything that was done here was very interesting, the results as well, and the analysis that came up through this panel are really very interesting and a confirmation that we're walking in the right direction. Great, Alina. I think we are due, we are late here, but we have specialists here. I would like that in 1 minute to talk about traffic charges or traffic taxes. Is that a policy that is still difficult to implement? So if you could please tell us in 1 minute, which are your recommendations to move forward with policy to implement taxes per traffic congestions in 1 minute or less, please. Yes, Dario, go ahead. No, Lina first, you go ahead. Yes, effectively, our great challenge with taxes per traffic congestions were to be accepted not only by citizens, but also on behalf of the political sector, let's say. This initiative went through the district council before this administration, and it did not pass. From the mobility secretariat, what we are doing is to review the policies of demand management, especially here, they exist. They have a long history in Bogota, and we are looking to have more effective demand management policies aligned to what has been proven and works in other cities. So what we're doing right now is implementing rush hour and batch, which is solidary. The people that choose to use their car, they can pay for the exemption of this restriction instead of buying a second car, which was happening before, and we observed that in Bogota. So we are reviewing the demand management policies that are already in place, that people are familiarized. In Bogota, many people defend this policy, so we're analyzing how to have a better demand management. I'm sorry, Dario, let me interrupt you because I want to give you a piece of data. Colombia is part of the few countries in the region that have a car industry. 6.6% of industrial GDP and 2% of national GDP is generated by this industry, and about 30% of the vehicles are national, 70% is imported. Just that information to contextualize your comment that will probably thread together all of the industry incentives and potential challenges faced by a policy like this. Yes, that use of industrial GDP and employment, that the whole chain of vehicle and motorcycle sales is one of the issues that in this recovery out of the pandemic, what we mentioned slightly today, is rather important. But we have, and it's very fortunate to have Lina tell us about the use of this Solidarity Pico and Placa tax to move ahead in economic measures for the management of the demand that we are needing, because they are effectively in need, because we continue subsidizing cars and motorcycles without capturing the externalities that they generate. We have parking out of the way. Well, it has the tariff frozen. Another type of parking was approved, but we have difficulties to implement it. We have very polluting vehicles that are the ones that pay the least, because they pay in connection to the value of the vehicle and not of the effects it generates. So we have to keep working in that direction, and we need to have this balance. I don't want to scare the industry nor the owners, but we have to internalize the externalities as part of the process that these models and this work helps with. Thank you very much, Dario. Jibet, maybe one reaction, because you also mentioned the smart congestion thing. Thank you very much, Laureen. I think that Lina and Dario mentioned some of the opportunities that can come up for Bogota. Once again, I believe that they have been working with pick and plate, solidary pick and plate, in many opportunities that can have benefits for the city, and also the restrictions in the implementation of pick and play that had created additional car purchases. So it is always difficult to make up your mind due to the indications and the acceptance of users. We have to be very bold, and that is valid for Bogota and cities in Latin America, but everywhere in the world as well. I think that it is possible to learn, as you mentioned, Lina, some international experiences. The largest cities in Latin America are unique, and they have very specific qualities. So there is a bit of trial and error, but nobody wants to make too many errors. So we have to be very smart to implement some of the policies that can help reduce pollution generated by these private vehicles. And I also believe, and this is not in the short term, but in the midterm, for example, when we start having the operation, some new projects, as the first line of subway in Bogota, or other projects like the Metro Tram, other modes that can promote public transport. Some users, not many, can stop using cars, not many, but this is a very complex work. This is very complex work, and I think that Bogota is headed in a very good direction, and it's a good thing to foster that direction and take some bold decisions that can also have consequences in acceptability.
Very much, Jibet. Perhaps we could hear some reactions from Transmilenio, the Environment Secretariat.
No sé, Rick. Adelante, Sofía.
Yes, Sofia, you have the floor. Thank you. I fully support that measure. I think we need to promote these kind of measures that de-incentivize the use of private cars, that make it possible to identify the negative externalities and to make the most of that. And of course, this means having more funding sources for the public transport integrated system. So yes, we welcome this with open arms. Thank you, Sofia. We see that this is a mechanism to incentivize mode change, which is something that is sort of at the foundation of the city's decarbonization roads. So the other thing that we could supplement it with is the reduction of the need to move, which is something that is being contemplated in the city's territorial organization plan. We're talking about 15, 30 minutes. That is how much cities need to organize their territory, to arrange motorized transport modes, to reduce the amount of trips. This goes beyond the transport sector. It goes to the planning sector, and it's a long-term measure. So in the long term, we have to get ready. We need to arrange the travels and trips. We do not have to underestimate congestion charges and education, because these congestion charges will be somewhat accepted by the citizens if they don't feel that this is just a mechanism to take money out of their pockets, rather than something to benefit the whole city in terms of air quality, but also in the mitigation of climate change and the improvement of citizens' commute time. So in the short term, it's complicated. I mean, if you tell my mom that they're going to charge her because of if she uses the car, she won't get it. But we need to work a lot, and we need to consider long-term strategies for future transport consumers and users. Thank you, Ricardo. I think you somehow summed up perfectly everything that we have talked about in the panel. We need short, medium, and long-term measures with the different players. I took a lot more than the stipulated time, so we will close here. We will finish this session. It was extremely enriching. All the comments and suggestions that you mentioned throughout the panel will help us strengthen the conclusions and recommendation of both studies, which will hopefully be published soon on the ITF and IADB's website. I would then just close and only make an advertisement for the audience. Tomorrow we will have the last session, which will be focused on the results for the city of Buenos Aires. So we hope to see you there. Thank you again for your time. Have a great day.